Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well and welcome to another video, and today we're doing my January wrap-up. So we're going to talk about all the books I read in January, and January was a great start to the year for me because I unlocked a new achievement, which is actually completing my entire January TBR. So I had 100% completion rate. I had 7 books on my January TBR and I read all of them, which is kind of unheard of for me because I'm typically at around a 50% completion rate for my TBRs. So this is actually kind of great and also very surprising for me because it's so unlike me. The TBRs for me are just kind of like a guide for like a selection of books that I'm excited to read during that month. I'd like to get to reading that month, like kind of like hopefuls, you know, but never like force myself to read them if I'm not in the mood for it, because the last thing I want to do is put myself in a reading slump by reading a book that I'm not in the mood to read. And the whole purpose of this hobby is for fun. For me personally, reading is about finding the right book for the moment that you're in. So I'm never mad at myself for not completing a TBR if I don't, or if I'm at 50%, that's great. My TBRs usually aren't super big. Like I usually choose around 6-7 books or something like that so that it's not overwhelming. Like if the mood strikes to read those books, then I will, but I never make it like a point to force it. So the fact that I finished my January TBR, it was a total surprise. I definitely didn't expect that to happen. So that's a new achievement unlocked. I'm definitely not expecting that to be the case for every month moving forward, but you never know. You know, we might surprise ourselves. Also, and maybe more importantly, I did say that in 2026, I wanted to kind of like change my ratio of genres that I'm reading because I was mainly reading romance. I want to say I was like 60, 65, maybe 70% romance and like 30-35% romantasy, fantasy. And I wanted to change that to be about 50-50. And January is a month that I did actually achieve that as well. Because like I said, I read 10 books. 5 of them were romantasy and 5 of them were other. So like a mix of thriller, romance, and dark romance. So that is something that I do actually want to put effort into this year because I really want to see myself be kind of closer to that 50-50 split at the end of the year. So January as a whole, I would say pretty good. We did pretty good. So let's get into the wrap up. Let's get into the stats for January and go over all the books that I read. So like I mentioned, I read 10 books during the month of January, which equated to 4,095 pages. Of those 10 books, 4 were fantasy, romantasy, 1 was a paranormal. So that's the 5 I was talking about that's like in the fantasy, romantasy kind of genre. And 1 was a thriller, 1 was a dark romance, and 3 were romance. The first book I read in January was Game Changer by Rachel Reed, and this is the first book in the Game Changer series, and this is a male-male hockey romance. This was really, really sweet. It follows Scott and Kip, and Kip works at Straw and Berry, which is kind of like a smoothie place, and he makes smoothies. I think he still lives with his parents, and he's like a history major in school, something like that. And Scott is a professional hockey player. And one day Scott comes in, the day before his next game, he comes in to get a blueberry smoothie. And he's been on a losing streak for a very long time with his games, so it's a huge surprise to him when the next day he actually ends up winning. And when they have like a win, they tend to have like superstitious tendencies, and he wants to kind of like recreate the same thing that he's done, like basically do the same thing he's done before that win every time before a game. So each time he has a game, he goes into Straw and Berry to get himself a blueberry smoothie. So because of all those visits and him chatting with Kip, they kind of develop a little bit of a friendship. They go on a date and things kind of like kick off between them. Now Kip is out with his friends and family, but Scott is not because he feels like it wouldn't be well accepted in like the hockey community and the hockey industry and the way that hockey players are perceived, and just in general he doesn't really feel comfortable coming out with everybody, but he does really want to have a relationship with Kip, and that's important to him. So this is kind of like their journey dealing with that and how they approach the situation. This was very, very sweet in terms of the romance, and they had like very sweet moments in between kind of like all the spice that happens because this is a very spicy book. I think this series in general is very, very spicy, and it does get right into it like from the very beginning. So if you don't mind a lot of spice in your books, this does have a very sweet romance on top of it, and how much they actually cared for each other really showed through the writing, and there was a lot of emotion in the writing and a lot of emotion in the story. So I felt like this was a very sweet love story, and I really, really enjoyed it. There are also some heartbreaking moments that did kind of like bring me to tears at the end, but overall it was just really sweet and heartfelt, but also very, very spicy. So just keep that in mind. I ended up giving this one 4 stars, and I'm definitely continuing with this series. So that's the first book we read in January. The next book I I picked up was The Housemaid by Frida McFadden, and I read and listened to this on audio because the audio for this is actually very, very good. I really like the voice actor for this, and this is a thriller. And it follows the main character, Millie, who just gets released from prison for whatever crimes she committed, and she's looking for a job because she's living out of her car. So she inquires with the Winchester family about kind of like a live-in housekeeping position, and she gets hired on the spot. So that's great for her because she can move right in, but things end up turning out to be a little bit weird because the room that she's in, she's kind of like put in this attic room that has a lock on the outside and the window is painted shut, and it's just kind of like a little bit creepy and weird. Even though seemingly the people who hired her are kind of like normal, like they seem normal. The woman who hired her, her name is Nina, and she has a daughter and a husband, and besides like some confusion and some like miscommunications and stuff like that, and the daughter being a little bit of a brat, like everything seems kind of normal until some weird things start happening and you are hit with like twist after twist after twist that I never would have guessed. I never would have guessed any of these twists. This was such an unputdownable, bingeable book that I read it in like 1 or 2 sittings. It's such a fast read. If you've never read Frida McFadden before, which I haven't, this is my first Frida McFadden book, this is a really great place to start. And now that it is a movie, all the more reason to pick this up and read it before you watch the movie. So I really, really enjoyed this, and I'm definitely going to be reading more Frida McFadden books in the future. I definitely didn't expect that I would have such a good time with a psychological thriller, and I rated this one 4.5 stars. Then the next book I read was Branded by Saffron A. Kent, which is a dark cowboy romance. This one unfortunately didn't hit for me. I really didn't like the main characters in this. Like, I didn't like their dynamic or like their relationship or anything like that. And especially like the main female character and her friend were just kind of like insufferable to me. I personally didn't vibe with this book. I really didn't understand like why she would be into him because he just really didn't give her any reason to be into him, you know? This was one of those books where it just didn't make sense and it didn't seem realistic. Like, I know this is a dark romance, so it's not really supposed to be realistic, but I feel like the romance between the two main characters, like the reasons why one falls for the other, it still has to have like some sort of like realism to it. And this one just didn't do that. It just gave like major like Stockholm Syndrome vibes, and I just wasn't into it. It cringed me out. So the premise of this book basically follows these two girls who are best friends. They're in college, and throughout their life, they kind of just like switch spots because they look similar and they sound similar. Rivalry is the main character, and her friend hasn't really been good at school, so Rivalry kind of like does her assignments for her. And for one of her assignments, she basically has to interview an inmate, like a prison inmate, through the prison like pen pal system, so like through writing letters to inmates. And so Rivalry is the one doing that assignment for her. So she connects with this guy Bo, and they kind of like have a little bit of a relationship through letters, and now he's being released on parole and he wants to meet. So she goes and she meets him at a cafe, and then somehow this escalates into a forced marriage situation, which honestly it was kind of cringy because things just didn't add up. Things didn't make sense. It wasn't realistic in that way, and I just really wasn't vibing with the story. Like I said, I didn't really love the main characters and the way that they approached situations and the things that they focused on. I didn't really like the things that she focused on, the things that upset her in like all of the situations that she was in, because the entire time I'm just like, you're focusing on the wrong things here, you know? And I really didn't understand like why she would have feelings for this guy in the first place. Like, this did have some sweet moments, some redeemable moments, but for the most part it felt very repetitive in the things that they said and did, and I just like, I didn't vibe with it. I didn't vibe with the characters. I didn't like the decisions that she made. I also felt like she was very insufferable for the most part, and I just can't get into books like that when I can't like connect with the main characters, any of the main characters. I do think this is going to be a series. I think this is a relatively new release. This came out in October 2025, and I think there is going to be another book in this series. I'm not sure what this series is called, but I really don't think I'm going to be continuing this one, which is kind of sad because it's a dark cowboy romance, and I've never read a cowboy romance before that was like in the dark genre. So this one unfortunately didn't hit for me, and I ended up rating this one 2 stars. The next book I read was Silver Elite by Danny Francis, and this is the first book in the Silver Elite series. The second book is coming out later this year, which I'm very excited about because I actually really enjoyed this book. I feel like this book has gotten some mixed reviews in terms of like people liking it, people disliking it, but I definitely liked it. It wasn't a 5-star or anything like that, but it was one of those really fun fantasies that's like very easy to understand, very easy to get into. There's a lot of action and a lot of like high stakes stuff happening in this, so I personally was like really into it and I really enjoyed it. I did vlog this one in my Spin the Bottle vlog, so watch that video if you want detailed thoughts on this book, but I just really liked it. I had a great time with this. It follows the main character Wren Darlington, and she is a modified because this is set in a dystopian world where some people are modified with powers and some people are not. So the people who are modified with powers, when they use their powers, their veins kind of like glow silver. So that's kind of how like the humans, the non-modifieds, can tell who's a modified and who's not, and then they basically basically execute them because they don't want to be taken over by anybody who has powers. So this girl's a little bit different because her veins don't glow silver when she uses her powers, and she's also kind of like in hiding because her uncle is part of the rebellion, or he's been part of the rebellion and he's escaped, and he keeps her in hiding as well to protect her. But one day something happens where she's basically kind of like forced to expose herself a little bit. Not the fact that she has powers, but because she's very skilled at like being like a marksman, like an expert marksman, and like she can shoot very well and hit a target from like a very far distance. And so she then gets recruited into the military program by Cross Reddington, who is the general's son. So now she's forced to be in the program. She doesn't want to be in the program, and she's basically kind of like trying to sabotage her way out of it until something happens that makes her change her mind, and now she basically needs to try to become part of the Silver Elite, which is like the elite group of the military program. So that's basically what this book is about. She's kind of going through the academy. She's still in hiding. She can't really trust anybody. She's making friends. She's making enemies. She's having a bit of a romance, and it's just like really fast paced and like easy to understand, and I really enjoyed this world. So I had a great time with this book. Highly recommend this series if you want like kind of like an easy fantasy with not a lot of world building or anything like that, and just something that's like very fast paced with some trials and like a mystery element to it. So I ended up rating this one 4 stars, and I'm very excited for the next book in this series. Then the next book I picked up was Last Call at the Local by Sarah Grunder Ruiz, and this was a really cute romance. This one has mental health rep. The female main character in this, Rain, is struggling with ADHD, and the male main character, Jack, is struggling with OCD and violent intrusive thoughts, which is a new one for me because I've never read anything in a book about that particular mental health issue. Essentially what's happening in this book is she is a traveling musician, and she basically gets robbed on the train from Dublin to like this small town. I forget what the small town was called, but she basically loses her phone, she loses her luggage, she basically loses everything, all her money. And so she stops in this little pub called The Local to kind of like get her bearings, and she ends up meeting Jack, who's the owner of that pub, and they start having kind of like a conversation. She kind of like shares with him what happened and that she's afraid she's gonna have to go home to Boston because she failed at being a traveling musician, and he's kind of like asking her for advice about how to make his pub better because he's not been getting a lot of business. She gives him a few ideas which he thinks are very good, and he decides to actually offer her a job of being like an event coordinator to help with his pub and also like a place to live. So she accepts because she doesn't want to go home, and it turns into a romance. But the romance is really, really sweet between them because they are like kind of like helping each other and making each other better because of like all their mental health issues and everything. And they come up with a really good arrangement that works for both of them to just kind of like help each other be better. And that's really all you can ask for in a romance. So overall, I really enjoyed this. It wasn't like my favorite book, like I wasn't like super into the book, but I still had a good time reading it and kind of like learning about like the different aspects of their mental health issues, especially like Jack's because of like the violent intrusive thoughts and like how he dealt with that. So I found this interesting, but not the best book I've ever read, and I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars. The next book I listened to on Spotify was Bound by Ali Hazelwood, and I'm pretty sure this is only available on audio. There's no like paperback or Kindle edition or anything like that that you can get for this book. If you want to read it, you have to basically listen to it for now. And this one is a paranormal. It follows the main character, Veronica. She goes by Vero, and she works at this antique dealer shop, and her job is to basically authenticate very old artifacts. And she works with this group of people, like this really sweet group of people who are basically responsible for different things like the register and authenticating coins and just like different things like that. And she kind of has like built this like found family around them, but unfortunately the antique shop is not doing very well financially, and they could potentially have to lay off one of the ladies that she's like very fond of, you know, in order to save on overhead. But one day this guy comes in, Dr. Victor Ashwood, and he basically commissions her to create a replica of a 9th century book, and he's willing to pay her $1 million for it. So after some deliberation, she decides to help him because they really need the money to keep the shop afloat. And so it kind of goes from there. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. It was really cute. It was very interesting. I think the audio was like 7 hours long, so it wasn't like necessarily a novella, but it was on the shorter side. So it wasn't super short, which gave you enough time to actually like feel a connection with all of the characters and like kind of understand the reasoning as to why she wants to do this for her friends and kind of like feel a connection to everything. There is a little bit of a romance in this. I personally didn't really care for the romance that much, but I did really like all the characters and kind of like how the story and the plot progressed. So I ended up rating this one 4 stars. Then the next book I read was Zodiac Academy, The Awakening, which is the first book in the Zodiac Academy series. And this is another one that I vlogged in my Spin the Bottle vlog. And this one I actually really liked a lot more than I thought I would going into it. This one follows the 2 main characters, Darcy and Tori Vega, who are changelings. changelings. They're fae changelings, and they're basically living in the human world. And their parents are killed when they're young, and they become orphans and they go into the foster system, and now they just turned 18. So they're kind of like out of the foster system, and they're living on their own and trying to make ends meet because, you know, they didn't really have a very good setup. And randomly, out of the blue, this guy comes to tell them that they have an inheritance waiting for them in the fae world, that they're changelings, they should have magical powers, and basically all they have to do to claim their inheritance is come to Zodiac Academy, go through the program, and graduate. So of course they're like, yes, we're going to do that because they're used to taking risks. They currently don't have any way of like surviving in the human world because they don't have any money, they don't have jobs, and they've kind of like resorted to committing crimes to survive. So this sounds like a pretty good deal to them, and they decide to go. However, when they get to the Zodiac Academy, they learn a few things. They learn that their parents were actually the king and queen of Solaria, and they are actually in line for the throne. They can basically reclaim their throne and basically be the queens of Solaria if they choose to do so. But they also have to fight the celestial heirs for that because there's 4 sons from these 4 different affluent families who were going to take over the throne together because these girls were basically lost and, you know, they needed somebody to step up. So these 4 celestial heirs have been trained on how to become kings of Solaria, and they want that throne. They want that power. Most of the people in Solaria are in support of the celestial heirs because they feel confident in like their ruling and like how they're going to rule the land, and they just don't feel confident that the queens, not knowing anything about the land, not knowing anything about their powers, would be very successful queens. So they kind of like want to push them out, make them want to leave on their own by bullying them, and a lot of people at the school basically bully them in order to get them to quit. So I really did like this book. I like the setup of the book. I like that we're learning the world along with the twins because they themselves aren't familiar with the world and they don't really know how things work. And I like that it's not kind of like an info dump right at the beginning. We as the reader are learning it as we go, which I really, really like. And I thought this was a really, really great start to the series. It definitely got me hooked, and I'm very excited to continue the series. There were a few things about the things that they did and like the main characters and everything that were kind of annoying, and I'm really not sure how this is going to turn into a romance, but I am really into like the story and the plot, and I'm very excited to continue the series. I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars, and I think in my vlog I said I rounded down to 3 stars on Goodreads, but I have since changed that to rounding up to 4 stars on Goodreads. But 3.5 stars in general. I had a really good time, and I'm very excited to continue the series. Then the next book I picked up was Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reed, and this is the second book in the Game Changer series, and this one follows Shane and Ilya. I feel like I liked the first book in the series better than this one, but I did really like the ending and like the last like 4th or 1/3 of this book that really like kind of like turned this one around for me. This one starts off with the 2 main characters being on rival teams, so they're playing on opposite teams, playing against each other, and it turns into more of like a friends with benefits kind of thing. It again goes right into the spice right from the beginning, which is fine, but I just didn't feel as many kind of like sweet moments between the 2 main characters, and I didn't really feel like their romance or like their relationship or anything like that until like the last like 1/3 of the book, which really did redeem the story for me. I felt like the first 2/3 really kind of lacked emotion, and I feel like I really need that in a book, like in order to feel the romance between them and kind of like understand why they are into each other. But this one was more of like a friends with benefits kind of thing, but it does end up turning into kind of like a sweet romance towards the end. I do wish it kind of happened sooner, like happened like earlier in the book instead of waiting till like the very end, but I'm still really glad that it happened because like the first part of the book was reading like a maybe like a 3-star 3.5 to me, but then like the last part of the book really kind of like brought it up, so I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I am ready to kind of like start the show now because I've read the first 2 books, and I believe that the show follows this book, but I haven't started watching that yet, so I'll definitely keep you guys updated on that. But that's the next book that I read. Then the next book that I read was The Book of Azrael by Amber V. Nicole, and this is the first book in the Gods and Monsters series, and this is another one that I vlogged in my Spin the Bottle vlog. So in this world there are basically gods and monsters, and the gods world basically collapses into the world of humans and monsters. Many humans die, many of the monsters die, but some of them survive. And the main character Diana is an Igmorthan. She is a monster, and she's basically like the main weapon or maybe second in command to Caden, who is the leader of the monsters, okay? But in order to save her sister, she ends up betraying him and kind of working with the gods, working with Liam, who is like the leader of the gods or like the main god or something. And she kind of like makes a deal with him in order to save her sister. And her goal is basically to find this Book of Azrael, which is an ancient artifact, because this book apparently is like the world ender, and Caden, being like the villain, is in pursuit of that. So now that she's working with the gods, she basically has to keep it out of his hands, and she's helping the gods kind of like find this book. So that's basically the setup of this. She does end up having a romance with Liam, which I actually really like their romance because they both struggle with different things and they kind of like help each other in a very sweet way. So I really enjoyed the romance. They also do go on a little bit of a journey together when they're trying to like locate this book. They visit like different places, different characters, and this is kind of like a little bit of a journey fantasy, which I really enjoyed. However, I did find the world building in this book to be very confusing. It's a lot of info dumping right from the beginning, and then there's also like little bits and pieces that are pertinent to like the actual plot, kind of like hidden within the writing that you kind of have to pick up on, and if you miss it, you kind of like get a little bit confused. So I did find myself being a little bit confused as to what was happening, and there were just like a lot of characters that I had a hard time keeping straight. This is the first book in a series, so I do understand like why it was done this way, but I do also feel like it could have been done in a more digestible way to kind of like make it easier for the reader to follow. So I didn't love that part of it because I did find myself to be a little bit confused at times, but overall I do like where the story is going and I like the plot of this book, so I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars and rounded up to 4 stars on Goodreads. And then the final book that I read in January finally is Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros, which is the third book in the Empyrean series. I've been putting this book off because the last book in the series, Iron Flame, put me in a reading slump, and I was kind of afraid that the same thing would happen after I read this one, but it was definitely not the case because I really enjoyed this one. This one was very high stakes. This book will put you in a state of anxiety throughout the entire story because so much is happening in it. There's so much war, battles, and like action and stuff like that, which makes it very fast paced and kind of like gripping. It was definitely a page turner for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not going to go into the plot or anything like that because of spoilers, but I will say that you get so much more of like the dragon communication in this one, which I really thoroughly loved. I loved being back in the world with the dragons and hearing them talk to each other and hearing them communicate with Violet and like with Xaden and like everything that was going on there. It just felt really good to be back in this world, and I just really loved all the action that was happening in the story. It really kept you on your toes. I really didn't feel like I was bored at all with this book, so I had a great time reading this one, and I ended up rating this one 3.75 stars and rounded up to 4 stars on Goodreads. So these are the 10 books that I read during the month of January. Please let me know down below if you've read any of these and what your thoughts were. I feel super accomplished with my reading in January because of all the things that I said in the beginning of the video, and also because I finally read this book, which honestly has been sitting on my shelves for a year and I just kept putting it off, and that was for absolutely no reason because this was really good and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you made it to this part in the video, please leave me a dragon emoji for Onyx Storm because I finally got this off my physical TBR and I'm actually very excited to continue with this series whenever the next book comes out. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. Let me know if you've read any of these and what your thoughts were, and leave me a dragon emoji for Onyx Storm. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!